Random House Audio presents The Art of Happiness in a Troubled World by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Howard C. Cutler, M.D. Read for you by Marc Cashman. Introduction. A while back, I was invited to Australia to deliver the opening keynote address at an international conference on human happiness. This was an unusually large event, which brought together 50 leading experts from around the world to speak about happiness, thousands of attendees, and even the Dalai Lama, who appeared on the second day as the featured speaker. With so many professional colleagues gathered in one spot, there was plenty of lively discussion on a wide range of topics. During a lunch break, I overheard several colleagues arguing about the merits of some recent articles in the Australian newspapers, touching on a debate going on in positive psychology circles. Positive psychology is a new branch of psychology, often referred to as the science of human happiness. The question being debated was, if the goal is to increase human happiness, which is the better approach? To focus on inner development or social welfare? In other words, should efforts be devoted primarily to developing techniques that individuals can practice to increase personal happiness, or should we focus on improving social conditions, creating conditions that allow the members of a society to thrive and result in greater happiness for the population as a whole? It seemed that the debate could be quite contentious at times. Some championing the social approach were characterizing positive psychology, which largely focused on finding effective methods of increasing personal happiness, as little more than another self-indulgent pop psychology fad, concerned only with a self-centered pursuit of personal gratification. Of course, the positive psychology camp had some powerful arguments in rebuttal. While not denying that having one's survival needs met was a prerequisite for happiness, they went on to point out that since happiness is a subjective state, involving an individual's attitudes, perceptions, emotions, and so on, ultimately it was necessary to focus on a person's inner state, on an individual level, to increase happiness. In addition, addressing the claims that working on increasing personal happiness is a self-absorbed, selfish pursuit, they pointed to studies showing that increasing personal happiness makes an individual more charitable, more giving, more willing to reach out and help others, and it is unhappy people who are more self-focused and selfish. Until that moment, I had been unaware of the extent of this debate, which in a way could be boiled down to a fundamental question of one's basic orientation: me or we. So when I first heard people debating this issue, I was riveted. As it turned out, the Dalai Lama and I had spoken about that very same issue during the course of some recent discussions we were having about the relationship between the individual, the greater society, and human happiness, seeking to answer questions such as, what is the effect of society on an individual's happiness? If societal problems undermine our happiness, what can we do about it? What is an individual's responsibility to try to bring about social change? And how much can a single individual do anyway? Those discussions, which include some of the conversations chronicled in this book, were part of an ongoing dialogue about human happiness that we originally began in 1993. In order to put these conversations in the proper context, I think it will be helpful to step back and briefly review the history of the Art of Happiness book series and the radical changes that have taken place within both the scientific community and the general public with regard to our perception and understanding of happiness. History of the Art of Happiness. It was the beginning of the 1990s when I first began to think about collaborating with the Dalai Lama on a book about happiness. The Dalai Lama had already written 36 books by that time, but since they appealed primarily to students or practitioners of Buddhism, His books had failed to find a wide readership among a general Western audience. I had known the Dalai Lama for about a decade by then, enough time to realize that he had much wisdom to offer non-Buddhists as well as Buddhists. So, I began to envision a book written for a general Western audience, distilling the essential principles that had enabled him to achieve happiness. By focusing on the practical application of his ideas in daily life, and by framing his views within the context of Western science and psychology, I hoped to ultimately come up with an effective approach to finding happiness that combined the best of East and West. The Dalai Lama readily agreed to my proposal, and we eventually began work on the project in 1993, during his first visit to my home state of Arizona. Inspired and excited by the project, I decided to temporarily give up practicing psychiatry in order to devote my full attention to writing the book. I estimated that it would take 6 months to complete the book, and with the Dalai Lama as a co-author, I was certain I'd have my choice of the top publishing companies. I miscalculated. 5 years later, I was still working on the book and still adding to the thick, demoralizing, ever-growing stack of rejection letters on my desk. Letters from literary agents and publishers who were uniformly convinced that there was no mainstream audience for books by the Dalai Lama, no market for a collaboration between him and a Western psychiatrist, and no public interest in the subject of happiness. With my financial resources depleted, it seemed I had few options left, and I was just on the verge of self-publishing a few copies of the book and returning to the practice of psychiatry when I had a stroke of luck at last. It was right at that point that an offhand remark made by the mother of a close friend to a stranger on a New York subway, a stranger who turned out to be in the publishing industry, initiated an unlikely series of connections that finally led to securing an agent and mainstream publisher. And so it was in 1998, with a small first printing and modest expectations, The Art of Happiness, a Handbook for Living, was at last released. Life is unpredictable. To our immense surprise, the book enjoyed an overwhelmingly positive response. It seemed to strike a chord in readers, resonating deep in the hearts of so many people yearning for something better in life. The book soon began to appear on bestseller lists around the world, including 97 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list. It was eventually translated into 50 languages and became a perennial classic with a readership in the millions. As a result of the book's popularity, we received many wonderful and moving letters, some of which expressed the request for a sequel, pointing out topics that had been omitted from the first book. For example, in focusing primarily on inner development as the path to happiness, I included discussion of inner obstacles to happiness, but largely avoided any mention of wider societal problems, even though the Dalai Lama regularly raised these issues in our private discussions and in his public talks. But it was now time to face the fact that human beings do not live in a vacuum. We live within a society, and that society has many problems that can affect our happiness. So, wishing to explore these societal and global issues in greater depth with the Dalai Lama, and respond to readers' requests at the same time, I approached him with the idea of collaborating on a sequel, seeking to answer the fundamental question: how can we find happiness in such a troubled world? He agreed. Although I originally intended to address this vast question in a single sequel to The Art of Happiness, a Handbook for Living, we quickly realized that the subject was too broad and included far too many topics to fit into just one book. So we divided the topics into a series of volumes. The second book in the series, The Art of Happiness at Work, published in 2003, applied the Art of Happiness principles to the setting where most of us spend the bulk of our waking hours during adulthood, the workplace. Like the first book, The Art of Happiness at Work was very well received and was a New York Times bestseller, But also, like the first book, it focused primarily on the level of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?